So a good API is intuitive to use because it generally follows a set of standards that other tools in that suite have used. But a good API is also interoperable. It's extensible. There's so many things. So I have a comment on bit flipping, but I'm going to save that for later.
Bandwidth for Changelog is provided by Fastly. Learn more at fastly.com. Our feature flags are powered by LaunchDarkly. Check them out at launchdarkly.com. And we're hosted on Linode Cloud servers. Get $100 in hosting credit at linode.com/changelog. What's up, party people? I want to introduce AWS Amplify as a new sponsor here at JS Party. Amplify is a suite of tools and services that enable developers to build full-stack serverless and cloud-based web and mobile apps using their framework and tech of choice. Amplify is built to make front-enders successful because you can use your existing skill set to build full-stack apps that in the past would require deep knowledge around back-end, DevOps, and scalable infrastructure. Amplify simplifies all of that. Amplify gives you easy access to hosting, authentication, managed GraphQL, serverless functions, APIs, machine learning, chatbots, and storage for files like images, videos, and PDFs. Check the link in the show notes for details or head to awsamplify.info/JSParty. Again, awsamplify.info/JSParty.
Welcome, everyone. You're listening to JS Party, a weekly celebration of JavaScript and the web. We record live on Thursdays at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern. That's 10 a.m. Pacific. Join in on the hijinks in the JS Party channel of our community Slack. It's totally free. It's totally cool. Head to changelog.com/community and sign up today. Let's do this. Hey, it's party time, y'all. Oh yes, the sound of those Breakmaster cylinder beats means it's time once again for JS Party. My name is Jerod, I'm your internet friend, and I'm very happy to have three of my internet friends with me. Suze is here. What's up, Suze?
What's up?
JS Party is up, and Amal as well. Howdy, Amal.
Howdy, howdy.
And we have Bone Skull here. What is going on, Chris?
What's up, everybody in the house?
Everybody in the house say yeah, yeah.
All the ladies in the house say yeah, yeah.
Okay, we have a listener request once again. Hey, we're just answering our listener requests left and right lately. So kudos to us, I guess.
You're so smart.
Did you know that we take requests like any good wedding DJ, or maybe even the bad ones probably take requests? You can head to changelog.com/request. Let us know a guest, a topic, a panelist. In fact, Amal, you were requested this time, my friends. And we would like to take it up on a future episode. So that's completely free and accessible. And this one was requested by Thomas Eckert, who also happens to be hanging out in the live chat room. So shout out to Thomas. Did you know we record live? Probably, because I say it all the time, but I'll say it again. Changelog.com/live every Thursday at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern. So Thomas wrote in, and he said,
in a previous episode, Amal said jQuery has a well-designed API. I kind of know it when I see it with good API design, but I would love to hear about the learnings, mistakes, pitfalls, and guidance for how to make a good API.
So the gauntlet has been thrown. We all have opinions on the matter. Some of us are expert API designers. I'm more of an expert API user. I have opinions because I use a lot of them, but we're happy to talk about that in detail. So first up, let's define the term. Let's lay the ground rules. I think a lot of people, when they think API, they immediately go to probably a subset of what the term is applied to, which is usually like a web API or a service, but it's more broad than that. Would anybody like to tackle API, define it, and then talk about the scope of the term?
I nominate Suze.
Seconded.
Well, we can start with what it stands for first, because otherwise that would be bad if we talked for an entire episode saying API, API, API. It does not stand for American Petroleum Institute in this case, which I think is an API. It stands for Application Programming Interface, which actually sounds like a mouthful. I guess like being able to describe it in a broad sense, usually I describe it as some software, like a collection of software abstractions that programmers used in order to kind of, you have two sort of contexts of software that need to talk to each other. And for different reasons, you would create an API in order to make it easier or a nicer experience in order to interact with, between those two, I guess, interfaces, to use the word in the definition.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the most abstract, broad definition you can give it. But, as an example, like jQuery is a library and it provides an API or a programming interface to the DOM in the browser. And what it does is it smooths over and creates consistency across all the browsers. But it also gives you a really nice feeling, enjoyable to use, and sort of, we'll talk about like what makes a good API in another segment, but it just makes it a nicer experience so that you can be much more productive as well. And so I think an API does a lot of different things, and that almost helps define like what it actually is. But then there's other things like, Jerod, you talked about how there are internet web-based APIs that actually link out to external services. And I mean, the two software pieces coming together there are, your particular website needs to speak to another external website in order to do something that external website is way better at doing for you. Instead of having some kind of like awful low-level interface to do that, you can provide everything from libraries to HTTP routes, in order for people to communicate with you. So it's really just a communication layer between different pieces of software, I guess. Can anybody do any better than that, given that I was put on the spot?
Yeah.
You mentioned the awful low-level things, but there are awful low-level APIs, right?
Mm-hmm. That is true.
So if you have I don't know, maybe you got some electronics module, like, I don't know, some sort of sensor or something, and maybe it speaks like SPI or something.
Mm-hmm.
You need to send it a series of bytes back and forth to talk with it and that sort of thing. And there's an example, I would say, of an API. SPI may be the protocol, but whatever those bytes are that you're sending back and forth to the module is the programming interface.
Right.
Likewise, things like, if you're old like me, maybe you remember like modems, where you would call up to a BBS and the API for your modem was the AT command interface. So there are low-level APIs and high-level APIs.
And I think that's a good point, because when you think about it, SPI is almost like the higher level than the lower level, which would be literally, pushing electrons and bit flipping by hand, right? And so it's totally interesting how you can get even lower than something like SPI, even though SPI is considered a low-level thing. So it's kind of like turtles all the way down, I guess, as far as APIs go.
That's like honestly such a good segue to how I kind of interpreted API. And by the way, Suze, your definition was amazing and like perfect as always. For me, like I kind of think of API as like a poke interface,
Explain.
Yeah.
I love that so much.
Yeah, like a poke interface, right? So it's like the way you are leveraging someone else's code, and it's the way it's like, here, poke my code this way if you want to get this thing, right? So like kind of like a game of Twister, right? But like with your fingers on the keyboard, and you're typing things to make this other thing do a thing, and so it's really a contract. It's like, hey, this is how I'm used. I do all this stuff underneath. I'm an iceberg, and all you see is my tip, like the tip of the iceberg, and you're not looking, you don't know what's underneath. And what's really nice about APIs in general is it's the abstraction, right? So someone or someone's has done the job of this, taking away some piece of complexity and bundling it up, packaging it up into a nice interface for you to poke.
Right. I like that.
I love this so much. This is like such a great definition.
Thank you. And to kind of segue on the like things we're going to talk about a bit later, like a poke interface should have a perfect intuition or whatever, right? For a user, right? So in the sense that like there's a set of typical, I would say, patterns for tools that fall within certain genres. And I think the more alignment there is, like for what a user would expect when using this type of a tool, like the easier it is for a user to like just, for a developer in this case, to just kind of, run with a new tool, right? Because if you're kind of like the less cryptic, the faster you're able to, like the less cryptic and the less domain knowledge, that you have to attain to use said thing, the faster you're able to move. And so Unix is, I think, for me, best API design like ever. I think like, Unix, and then jQuery as well, right? But like Unix kind of had some very forward thinking stuff when they were like, do one thing and one thing well and make things composable. And, if you think about how Unix is like, APIs are like these Lego blocks that all connect into each other. Like it's kind of amazing, So yeah.
Well, I will add my amen to that. I believe the Unix philosophy.
So yeah, so good API is intuitive to use because, it generally follows a set of standards that other tools in that suite have used. But a good API is also interoperable, it's extensible, there's so many things. So I have a comment on bit flipping, but I'm going to save that for later.
Let me add a couple of thoughts here real quick. So we talked about high level and low level, networked and maybe like local host, right? The broadness there, maybe the depth, where you can go all the way up the network stack to like an application API. Maybe you're talking about the Stripe API, and you can go all the way down to the hardware and talk about those low level APIs and bit flipping and different things. There's also kind of an inside out way of looking at it. So I joked earlier that I'm more of an API user, but if an API is an interface to your program and you write and you're a programmer, then you write APIs. So the simplest way to think about it is when you define a function, your function's name plus its external properties, such as the parameters it takes and those types, if it's typed, you are designing an API when you write a function. Now, you may be the only consumer of that API. Your own code may be the only one ever consuming it, but it's an API nonetheless. Or when you do like a capital uppercase poke API, like the Stripe API or the GitHub API, you're now writing a very similar thing conceptually. It's just that it has way more depth to it and things underneath it. And it's also it's third party. So you're calling into that from somewhere else. So that's why I say it's so broad, because it can go from like, how do I name my functions and how do I accept parameters, to how do I do OAuth, or how do I do REST correctly, or GraphQL, or these kind of decisions. So it really is such a broad thing. So that being said, so Amal kicked off like what we like. So we're going to talk about what makes a good API. And Amal enumerated a couple of characteristics, but she also says an API that she loves, or really a philosophy around APIs, which is the Unix philosophy. We thought it'd be nice to talk about, APIs that we admire or that we think are good, because when you talk about how do you design a good API, a lot of times the way you do something good is by imitation. And you say, I think that thing over there is good. I'm going to do it like that. This is how good authors become good oftentimes, is they read a bunch of books and they find authors they admire and they say, ooh, I would like to write as well as this guy or that gal. And we can do that with APIs as well. So what are some APIs that we consider good here on the panel?
Honestly, I think for me, I love the GitHub API, as problematic as maybe some consider it. Like, I think it's a really, like, the REST API is a good example of like how to, have good documentation, like structure, just organize your resources. The jQuery API, I used to really like the React API, not so much anymore. But I thought one of the reasons why React really took off initially was it really had a low amount of domain knowledge required to get started with it, right? Like it just leveraged a lot of JavaScript, and versus something like Angular, which I felt like at the time there was a lot of like cryptic knowledge around like how do you do loops in your templates, in pipes and filters and all this other syntax that you had to learn that was custom to Angular, right? So like low domain knowledge is good when folks are using your tool, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's so many tools. I can't, like, Stripe has an incredible API, right? So it's usability plus documentation, and like also the way Stripe handles its backwards compat is kind of amazing. Certain companies, I've worked at in the past are using actually very old versions of the Stripe API, but it's not that like the company is Stripe isn't maintaining an old version of a package for one company. It's just that they've designed their API to just be backwards compat, at all layers. And that's really, really like very, very good design that really saves the company a lot of money and lets people have enterprise users, because enterprise people, we know enterprise. One version for life. Like that's enterprise, So yeah, I mean, and we have Suze here who can talk all about Stripe. So
Absolutely. Chris, what do you think? What are some APIs that you admire, that you appreciate as a user of those?
Well, I don't do a whole lot of work talking with, web-based sorts of network APIs. But yeah, I think I agree that much of the GitHub API is pretty good. I often find myself frustrated, like, where is this thing? Well, it turns out the thing hasn't been implemented yet, or maybe it has, but it's not been exposed to the user. And so that's where I just start to, pound my head on the keyboard, but I like async await a lot, I picked up promises pretty early. I mean, certainly before it was, I feel like it was before it was standardized. And I was using Q, right? If you remember that library that had a promise implementation. Mm-hmm. And so I wrote a whole lot of, thens. And now I do not touch then because I do not have to. And it is very nice. I like using async await and promise.all to make sure I don't shoot myself in the foot with it. But yeah, I'm really happy about that one.
That's a good one as well. Suze, anything I'd like to add? Stripe has a pretty good API, but we've covered that one. So
I can't talk about that because I would be biased.
You're right.
I mean, so
and we've already said it.
I mean, quick note though, the first time I used the Stripe API, I was working at Kickstarter because Kickstarter transitioned to using Stripe for payments shortly before I started there. So we still had some work to do with just making our implementation more robust. And I remember the first time I looked at the Stripe docs, I wasn't expecting a lot just because, sometimes API docs are not the best. And I'm sure that we'll get to this topic very soon too. But I looked at the API docs and I was just so blown away because there were the little things putting your test mode API key in embedded in the documentation and things like that so that the copy paste things just worked and stuff like that. That actually made me say, wow, I would love to work at a company like Stripe who has this attention to detail in their APIs. And so, that is the reason why I'm working at Stripe now, because I had such a good experience with the API. As an engineer, I wanted to be part of improving that even further, which is really exciting. But to kind of give a slightly less biased opinion, I've used a ton, and I mean a ton of APIs over probably the last 5 to 10 years. And part of it is just due to hackathons. Part of it is just due to the nature of my job. I think the biggest standouts for me have been whatever I reach for the most often. So I reach for Twilio all the time because one, their SMS API, because I know they have 1 billion APIs now, but their SMS API and is just incredibly efficient. It's full featured. It has even TWIML is a great concept. So whenever I have to create a thing, and it's usually a web page scraper that texts me when something updates, right? That's always what I use Twilio for. I reach for it time and time again because it solves my problems so quickly. It's not that, it's the kind of evil that I know the best. It literally is a good experience, and that's why I reach for it every single time, because it solves my problem really quickly. The other things that I was impressed with when I worked at Microsoft was the cognitive, I can't believe, I only quit a year and a half ago, and I forget what it was called already, but the cognitive APIs.
Are you using Bing or Google to
just Bing
look
it.
up your...
I'm using DuckDuckDuckGo.
Just duck it.
That tells you what kind of person I am.
Just curious,
Do you duck things or do you go them? I don't know how to verbify that.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's just literally cognitive services. Yeah, it's cognitive services. So that, you don't have to create all your bespoke artisanal, artificial intelligence models and things like that. So if you want to do some relatively kind of cliche things with artificial intelligence, such as computer vision, automatic voice captioning and things like that, they have this huge family of different services, but it's a very nice interface to most of them via REST. So I've been really impressed with how much you can do with just one API call with the cognitive services. That was always very impressive to me when I worked there, and I thought that was a great example too.
Well, I won't add any because mine have already been said. Y'all stole mine. But I will talk about a couple of library-style APIs. We already mentioned jQuery. I think jQuery's API was brilliant for many reasons, which you can go back to listen to that episode, An Ode to jQuery, wherein we enumerate a lot of the reasons why. And therefore, anything that derives from that, Cypress being another one, a lot of tools. I like Mocha's API, by the way, which is really a nice one as well. Chris won't say it. I like BDD style test APIs, like RSpec style. It should do this, it should do that. Those kind of APIs are nice. I come from the Ruby world, and there's some really nice APIs over there. Active Record for Ruby on Rails, which is an ORM, which allows you to manipulate a database in a way that I still think is unparalleled in its ease of access and just doing things from memory and from guess and check. Like you just guess and it does it the way that you want to. Is a nice API to look at if you are looking at developing APIs. But yeah, GitHub, Twitter's API used to be sick. Like I loved it. Now they've kind of bastardized it over the years, much to their shame, I think, and they're trying to recover, sort of, as they treated third-party developers very poorly for a while there, and they're trying to recover that. But trust is easy to ruin and hard to gain back. But their API used to be very solid. GitHub's is really good. I like the REST API. GraphQL, I'm just not totally into it yet, but I hear that's also a good one. Believe it or not, there is some design that has to go into a GraphQL API, even though it is kind of like, pick your own food. You do have to decide what's on the buffet. And we talked about that back on our GraphQL episode, where we used a buffet style analogy for GraphQL, which it works once in a while, but also has its faults. Most metaphors fall apart and most sentences fall apart. And this one's also falling apart. Amal, what you got?
I don't know. I thought that buffet analogy was pretty strong. It's kind of a hard thing to follow,
We beat it to death on that episode. K-Ball really latched onto it.
Really?
Oh, yeah. K-Ball loved it.
Yeah.
You got to go back and listen to that one.
Oh, yeah, K-Ball would have had a field day.
He did. I think that episode's called GraphQL is the bacon to your something.
To your something. Yeah, no. I can imagine Cable like salsa dancing throughout around a buffet, because he's such a good dancer. Have you seen him dance? It is impressive.
Oh, he's really good at it. Yeah.
Yeah, very, very impressive. I think just to kind of piggyback off of Suze's comment on Twilio, I would plus a million that. That's really one of the better APIs because they've just put a lot into ramp up, I would say. And so what's really cool about just tools that, what I think that really invest in onboarding, right? So they kind of think of everything, how can we make this a one-click experience, right? Or one line, add the CDN, start working, anything tools do to kind of reduce the time that you need to be productive, right? So if you need an hour or more to be productive when you're importing a new tool, in 2020, I would say that's a very low bar, so so you should really aim to kind of get folks productive as quickly as possible. And that's a combination of docs, examples, starter kits, there's many ways to do that, to kind of really round out that number of how many minutes is it going to take for a person to be productive when using my thing, whatever that is. And so you gotta time is money is time, right, people? So gotta keep it moving.
What's up, JS Party people? Have you ever wondered if you could be offering a faster, less buggy experience for your customers? Well, with Raygun Error and Performance Monitoring, you have all the information you need at your fingertips to quickly find and fix errors and performance issues across your tech stack down to the line of code. Raygun makes it easy to monitor the impact of your performance improvements, quickly identify issues across web and mobile apps, and see how your code performs in the hands of your customers. This saves you time, this saves you money, and this saves your sanity. Head to raygun.com to join thousands of customer-centric software teams who use Raygun every single day. Again, raygun.com to give them a try with a free 14-day trial.
When talking about what makes a good API, for me, I appreciate an API that is at the, it finds that sweet spot in terms of the level of abstraction. So, when you are using one, for example, maybe you have this API you're talking to and you need to do some certain task. And to do that task, you need to make like 4 different function calls, right? But then you switch to this other tool or library, and you only have to make 1. Now, to me, like the one that only requires a single function call probably like maybe better understands how its users are trying to use it, right? Like they've done that research and they say, oh, well, this is a very common use case, and we're going to optimize for that. And so I think that's really important when designing an API, is to really know how your users what they want to get done and how they want to do it.
Yeah. You know what, Chris, you bring up a really amazing point, and one that is definitely not lost on me, because you're absolutely right. Like giving power users the ability to extend and override, whether it's default options or whatever else, is like super key, right? And I'd like to share a philosophy with you that I learned while working on a Scratch project. Scratch, like MIT Scratch programming language for kids and really anybody, but it's very cool. Check it out. We'll link it in the show notes. But Scratch has this really cool philosophy of how they approach their design, API design, which is they want Scratch to basically have low floors such that, it's easy for anyone to get started. They want it to have wide walls such that, you can do many, many things with it, but then high ceiling so that like its power users can go as complex as they need to, So the idea is low floors, wide walls, high ceiling. And like, that's just that's something that's stuck with me for so many years now. Like, I revisit it all the time. When you're designing something, make it accessible for newbies to be productive right away and make cool things, let people do lots of things with it, and then let power users still like not be shackled, and let them like have the composability and extensibility that they need to do what they need to do. And so it's just such a good point. Like,
it's easier said than done, though. Frequently because when I'm designing an API, it's generally some sort of library or something like that. And it's really a tug of war between, okay, how easy should this be or how extensible should this be? And it's really tough to get that right.
Yeah, one thing that I've heard be described, and this was actually the first time I heard of it was someone at Stripe mentioning it, but I'm not sure who the original person was. But this idea of a slow reveal. And so, when you first start using an API or you first start reading the docs for an API, it shows you how to do the thing that you're most likely going to want to do with it. Then because the API has been designed intuitively with what it exposes, like as you want to do more complex things or as you start having corner cases with what you're trying to do, there's this really lovely way that the rest of the API reveals itself to you without you having to learn a ton of stuff right at the beginning if you're just trying to get started with it. And I think that is definitely, in my opinion, one of the hardest problems to solve in API design, is trying to find that compromise right there, between power users and beginners, as we've sort of been discussing right now.
I like that, the slow reveal. It makes me think about a swimming pool. Maybe you have the shallow end, and they even have the ones where you just walk right in, right? And just kind of go slowly down to 3 feet. And everybody can swim in that side of the pool, the kids, the adults, whomever. It's very accessible, it's achievable, and it's not scary. But then you get like past a certain line, and it may go down to 8 feet, it may go down to 10 feet. You'll have a diving board, you'll have expert apparatus, and that area of the pool is clearly for a different audience, but they can get the exact same access through that shallow end as well. How do you do that, though? How do you actually achieve a slow reveal? I think you do have to know your audience to a certain degree first, much like writers have to know who they're writing for. I think API designers have to think, who am I designing this API for? And what does that audience look like, or as the best as you can? But how do you like slowly reveal? Do you have to just think like, what's the main thing everyone's going to do and start there?
A really simple version of this. So obviously there's lots of different tactics, but I would say that a really simple example that everyone can understand is having a ton of defaults of the way it operates, and then actually having very smart and intuitive overrides. And so that way you're starting with little, but then when you see how extensible something is, kind of similar to what Chris and Amal were saying, like people who want to then go and extend something, they can easily see like jump to that section in the docs, and then the same methods that they were using this entire time actually have this whole next level of things that you can not necessarily leave as default, if that makes sense.
I like that.
Yeah, smart defaults, I think, sort of like can kickstart that kind of slow reveal.
Yeah, and the smart defaults thing is so important because we are not born as experts. Experts are made, Experts are made because experts were beginners at some point, right? One day I was learning JavaScript, right? And so that day is not today. But, thanks to some level of low flooring, I was able to learn, right? And so like you have to keep the door open for folks. And I think one of the things that for me is so lost on many, many, many good tools and libraries in our community is context, We don't often do a good job of setting context for users. Like, what is this tool being used for? Why was it made? What problems is it solving? What's some prior art? Like a lot of that stuff is accumulated over time and experience. And, but for someone who's brand new to something, that context is really key. And so, it's very important to also, so between like the good defaults to get new folks, ramping up, and not just even new folks, anybody productive right away, right? Webpack did this with like its zero config. Create React app kind of did that. We don't worry about the tooling, just focus on learning the API, right? And really, like, I would say there's so much restraint that API makers, whatever, have to practice in order to kind of keep that floor low. Because one of the things that's really challenging is when you're a maintainer of a project, you have all the context in your head and you're actually kind of the worst person to write the docs because of that, And so it's a challenging thing. Like it's almost like you need a team of people who are able to mirror and ask you questions and make sure that like you're keeping that floor low, because you need a reality check to keep you honest. It's very challenging as a maintainer to write good docs for people who are new to the tool,
Agreed.
So what are some other aspects that make for good API design? I think one thing that I go back to is that good API design, like you can just take the API part out and still most of the rules still apply. Like, what is good design? Or you could say, what is good software design? Because again, go back to like you're writing a function that you're going to use. You are API designing, right? Whether you think about it like that or not, you are. And then of course you could take the software out and say, well, good design principles apply to good software design. Not one-to-one or not every single one, but generally speaking. So when I think about good design, there are a couple of things that I go back to, a couple of principles and idioms. Solid. Yeah, that's a solid one. The one that I was thinking of, which kind of plays into this conventional idea and into the everyone comes in through the same entrance, but then you can dig deeper, is the idea of the principle of least surprise or principle of least astonishment, where there's sensible defaults or the configuration is provided for you, what makes sense for most people. And then as you navigate and expand your use of that API, it works the way that you think it's going to work, right? As you explore, a great API, GitHub's is like this. Chris says sometimes he gets mad because he tries to find something and it ends up that's not even part of their API, but he probably could have guessed where it was if it was there, right? Like the things are where that you'd expect them to be. And that's the principle of least surprise, is it should work how you think it should work. And that allows people to explore and learn much quicker without constantly referencing the documentation. In fact, if you're trying to bring joy to a user, the best thing you can do for us is make us feel smart. And when I feel smart is when I can just guess where this part of the API is, or how do I do this? Oh, I bet I know how I do this because I understand RESTful APIs. It should live under /users, or it should be I post this to there. And when it is, then you're like, oh, I don't actually need the docs anymore. I've figured it out and I can just keep doing what I'm going to do. And so try not to surprise people. Try to put things in obvious, clear places, whether it's endpoints or whether it's function names or whether it's the way you accept arguments. And one of the ways you can be less surprising and less astonishing is to stay consistent. So if you accept a certain parameter to a function and you accept that in multiple functions, always accept it in the same order if it's an ordered thing, right? Mm-hmm. Like take it first every time. The jQuery again goes back to a very good example of this, right? You can call all these functions and use them pretty much the exact same way. and you find a new function and you're like, I wonder if I could chain this on like I could the other ones. Oh yes, I can do it the exact same way I've been doing everything else. It's not surprising. It's actually obvious. It's hard to be obvious. We take it for granted when it's there. But to come up with the obvious solution is difficult. That's why it's called design. And it makes me think of a book which is very famous in the design world called, it's called Don't Make Me Think, I believe. And it's like, one of these books that everybody buys. I've never read it because I already got what I think from the title. It's a great design of a title. I already know what he's going to say, and I completely agree with him. I'm sure there's tons of good details in there. But a good API doesn't make you think, or at least tries its best to be consistent and not surprise you. And I think that's one aspect of a good API.
Wow. Yeah. I would say that book really targets its audience, doesn't it? Like,
Yeah, it does.
oh, you open the book and it's actually just blank pages. Empty book.
Yeah, it could be. Bestseller. I think it's a bestseller.
No, Jerod, you had some like amazing points, and really like the whole thing of like, just don't do something unpredictable, right? Like solid helps you kind of align to that, solid principles, but and do one thing well, and just, I think keeping things modular, and just don't throw curveballs at people that are, like don't name a function get blah, 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 and then have that function be actually doing a mutation or a post, like naming also like is a way to signal like what this thing is supposed to do, But you know what? I kind of want to take it back a little bit, because I can't believe no one brought up Git, because Git for me is like one of my favorite APIs. I love Git. I'm like a power user. I have reached the point in my Git foo where it's like, I'm not afraid of like looking at my ref log, or I'm not afraid of complex merges or whatever. Like it's fine. I rebase all the time. I squash, whatever, the API is just so good. And one of the reasons why it's also so good is because, you just get man, and like you can see the docs right there in your terminal. You don't have to like context switch, what flag was this thing, or how do I do this thing? Like the docs are right there. It's very hard to beat that. It's very hard to beat like that experience of not having to leave your terminal while you're learning, like learning something and using an API and not having to, it's very hard to beat. I'm
going to diverge on this one because I like Git as a tool. I think it's very powerful, but I don't find its API or its interface was very difficult.
I'm on Jerod's side here. Yeah, I agree with Jerod.
I do know it now, and I do think it's powerful, and I appreciate what it does.
Yeah.
So I think technologically, it's spectacular. And the fact that the man pages and everything have gotten a lot better, and everything is right there at your fingertips. So I'm with you on all those points.
Yeah.
I think the actual command line interface, which is an interface, it's
hard to learn.
Very difficult to learn.
Yeah,
It's really hard to learn.
And once you learn it, it's kind of like Stockholm syndrome, but for me at least, it was hard for me to pick up.
Yeah, there's no slow reveal, there's no consistency in flags.
That's very true, actually.
Like it almost feels like every context within Git is like this completely separate story you have to learn. Like it feels like it's a bunch of tools thrown in together to kind of achieve the one goal you have, which is distributed versioning. Yeah, like it's amazing how I use it on a daily basis, and still every time I delete a tag or rename a branch, they're the two things that I get wrong every single time, because they're different between the different commands with the flags.
Yeah. I have to concede to all of you, because I think you're right. I think I'm confusing my love of the tool and what it does with the ease of use. And you're absolutely right. It did take me a number of years to get to where I am.
Right.
And it wasn't easy, and I think you're right. So I'm gonna walk that back.
Okay.
I was wrong. Use is right. I think you're right. But it's interesting though, isn't it? Like imagine a world where everyone could become an expert in Git like within a month. Like imagine that world. That would be a different world, right?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like GitHub is kind of interestingly bridging that gap a little bit with all of their UI. Like, I don't know if most people realize this, but I'm going to maybe blow your mind. Pull requests aren't a thing inside of Git. Does everybody know that? Does anyone know that like pull requests aren't a thing? Like, so if you go to projects like Mozilla and, Chromium and all these things
and Linux too.
Linux, yeah.
Yeah, they use patches.
They email each other patches.
Emailing each other files. Okay. Like, some of the most important projects in the world are not on Git.
Well, they're on Git. But
Well,
they're
no,
not on
sorry.
GitHub.
They're not on GitHub. Sorry. Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for correcting that. So, it's just funny. It's like, it is what it is. What Git is not on Git, by the way? I think, unless that's changed in the past, 2 years, I don't know.
Well, there was a long time where there was Mercurial versus Git, and Git was not the de facto. It was like they had to battle it out, kind of like VHS and Betamax.
Right.
And Mercurial's kind of gone the route of Betamax, but it still has its constituents for sure.
Right,
And I think
right.
I think Mercurial actually has a better API. Well, interface. I don't know if it's a programming interface, but at least the command line interface is way more approachable, which is one of the reasons why people liked it.
That's interesting.
But GitHub really mitigated that.
Yeah, but isn't it interesting though that GitHub just I feel like it just really bridged the gap in so many ways with confusion on the terminal and what you can do, and right? Now you can even suggest comments in line in a pull request, and you can actually say hey, here's a suggested change, and someone can accept it, and so essentially you're kind of abstracting away people's need to ever use a terminal between that and then their GitHub UI. So I don't know. So basically, I think the lesson for you here, kids, is if you build a bad API, someone is going to build an abstraction around you and make lots of money. Yeah, and make lots of money. And make lots of money, really, because even at NPM, I mean, there's so many things with NPM that were missing or not there, and mainly because the team was under-resourced and had so many other things to do, right? But the community built all these things around NPM that should have actually been in NPM. For example, bundle phobia or unpackage, or, you know what I mean? There's so many features that would be great to just be in NPM directly, but people had to build abstractions around it because it wasn't supported, with the NPM API. And so Yarn even, right? Workspaces wasn't a thing. And so we're going to build an abstraction around our connection to the registry. And so just lesson learned, if you're not solving it well, someone else is going to solve it better and faster.
That's a great point.
What up, friends? You might not be aware, but we've been partnered with Linode since 2016. That's a long time ago. Way back when we first launched our open source platform that you now see at changelog.com, Linode was there to help us, and we are so grateful. Fast forward several years now, and Linode is still in our corner, behind the scenes helping us to ensure we're running on the very best cloud infrastructure out there. We trust Linode. They keep it fast and they keep it simple. Get $100 in free credit at linode.com/changelog. Again, $100 in free credit at linode.com/changelog.
So, Amal, you mentioned solid, and I think we should probably just lay out what that is. So those are a set of really object-oriented programming design principles which have been formalized in books and courses and stuff. And there's 5 principles there. I don't know them all because I don't write good code. But single responsibility, I know. Open closed. The L, I don't know. It's like somebody's name.
Yeah.
Liskov, there you go.
Liskov substitution principle. Yeah.
There you go. Dependency inversion is another one. So these are all good things to learn and to apply in any sort of software design, specifically object-oriented software, which a lot of times if you think about an API, it's a lot like an object, right? It's kind of a black box that you access via the way it exposes itself, and you don't care how it works behind the scenes. So it's very much an object-oriented thing. But that's that. We'll link up the Wikipedia page as a starting place. It's a deep dive into solid, but it's definitely something you should be familiar with.
I like that you brought up, like, people shouldn't have to be able to care about, like, how you've implemented it and things like that. Because I think the thing that gets my goat the most about badly designed APIs is when you can feel the limitations that the software engineers who designed the API were running into, and you can feel that they've pushed that work back onto you. And they've leaked, like, it's called like implementation leakage, like they've basically made something harder for the user when the user should never have had to care about it in the first place, because you ran into a specific limitation that isn't even relevant, to having to limit the library, if that makes sense. And that sounds like very abstract, so I can give an example.
Please do. Yeah, because I'm trying to think of one and I can't.
It's really hard to think of it. Actually, I have 2 examples. So I'll cover React at first. So the thing that annoys me about React is that when you have a loop and you're iterating and you're spitting out things like based on an array or a map and you're returning components, you have to give it a key attribute, right? And it bucks at you if you don't do that. That is not something that should ever have to be necessary, in my opinion, in an API. You should not have to actually give a numeric key in order for React to be able to do its thing properly. It has no bearing on your app at all. You'll probably never ever use it. And so warning you that you didn't do it and forcing you to when you're not even going to use it in the first place, I think that's implementation linkage.
That's a really good point. I've always just been annoyed by that, but I thought it was just me. So I'm glad you've actually empowered me to complain more. Why do I gotta pass that to you all the time? It's such a pain.
It's really annoying. And another example is having to use class name instead of class. That's literally implementation linkage. And I actually really don't like working with React and think there are better options out there for these reasons. But again, that's not let's not do a turf war. One concrete example that I can talk about that happened in open source for me with Stripe was we released official types for the Node.js client library recently because there was a definitely typed community contribution, and then we actually put in a type definition into our actual library. We knew that this was going to be something that we would have to maintain going forward, and we wanted to know how expensive it would be to maintain, and we wanted to know, just how much attention to give it, right? So we really wanted to know who's actually using types in this library versus not using types. We just want to see what's the word?
Adoption.
That's the word. Thank you. Yes.
You're welcome.
So we didn't really have a good way of being able to see that in the telemetry and track that. Property that was introduced where if you wanted to use the TypeScript types, when you instantiated the library, you needed to specify a property that was TypeScript true, right? And when I saw this, I immediately burst into flames because it's just implementation leakage is the hill that I die on at all times. And so I saw it and I just said, hey, I'm just curious, what's this property about? What was the technical limitation where someone can't just use the types out of the box? And they said, well, we actually just want to know through telemetry, if they set that, then we know they're using it. And so we've made it a mandatory property just so that we can get accurate adoption statistics. And it's really just for the user so that we know if we can give more resources to it and we can argue for more resources at work to maintain it. So it was actually in the spirit of actually helping the user, but also having them specify that it's just not an idiomatic thing that you should have to do with TypeScript. It felt weird. And sure enough, we got people on Twitter asking about it. And so we had a big conversation about it. We were like, okay, so is it really that important that we know adoption? And can we really just commit to actually maintaining this, right? And can we maybe talk to users after a while to just see what the adoption actually is in other ways? And so we ended up pulling the plug and we completely removed that property that same day and released it. And I felt that was a huge win. But it is really interesting how quickly you can just leak one property and then, it kind of opens the gate for other leakage as well. So
yeah. Wow. It's almost I wish you could lint that. Wouldn't that be cool if you could automate it? It's where it's hey, am I leaking my implementation details? Yes, no.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like a nuanced thing.
Very nuanced.
I feel like I can sense that as somebody who's just used a lot of APIs, but I've never been able to verbalize it like you do. Maybe you have a superpower for that's leakage right there. Because I don't know if I'd actually identify something as leakage, even though I could probably know, I could point it out in retrospect, yep, that was that. So it seems like a nuanced thing to be able to actually determine this is an implementation detail, not something that's should be on the external side of your API.
Yeah, but in all fairness, though, Suze, you brought up such a good point about the React class name because, no, really, all of the deviations between JSX and HTML could have easily been abstracted and handled by the compiler. There's no reason to expose that to the user, and confuse them and or confuse designers who maybe are working and co-working with you, and you know what I mean. So I think that's such a good point. And from my understanding, the React team. That's just a decision they can't easily go back on right now.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
If they could do it differently, they would at this point. Yes. But it's just, I also think this is why it's important to have a diverse team designing an API, right? To kind of bring it back to empathy, because you have blind spots as an engineer, no matter how good you are, always you have blind spots. And so having people validate your work, use it, make sure it works for their use cases, and hopefully having those people maybe not be like you, whether it's demographically, whether it's they're working on a different thing, whether, just like diversity in all factors counts here. It's just someone that's not you, ideally,
Right. Mm-hmm. So we've covered a lot of ground here, but we have not covered one of the mainstays of APIs and good APIs is documentation. Mm-hmm. We've talked about it as we revered certain APIs. We talked about their docs. And I will say that Stripe gets a lot of credit here because they did come out with great API docs, web-based, readable things with all of the little details, which has since been emulated and repeated elsewhere. So we're thankful for that. But Stripe doesn't stand out quite like it used to. But that's because everybody basically copied that and they're like, oh, this is great. You have to give respect to the ones who changed the game. This is why Michael Jordan will always be the greatest basketball player, because he actually invented all the things that these guys now do. That's a hill I'll die on. But, Stripe really did that. So like a lot of the things that you see, like having the curl commands or like the 4 different languages that you can just like click your language and see what the call looks like in your language. Stripe invented a lot of those ideas and it was amazing. But thankfully, it's gone across the industry now a lot, especially businesses that run APIs have good docs. But again, to go to the APIs in the small, right, your functions, your packages, your modules, your libraries, these things are all APIs. And even if they adhere to these principles like least surprise, uniform access pattern, like all these things, still you have to describe what's going on, folks. So you can't just leave us out there to figure it out ourselves. We need help. That's like the core of accessibility, is like telling people about your API. So docs have to be there. What makes them good?
Wait a second. Wait. Hold on. Jerod, are you trying to say that my code isn't good enough for you? Like reading my code isn't just intuitive enough for you? Like it's just too much work or something? Like why do I need to put this into like English text when you can just read the code? Dude,
not your code, Amal. Yours is fine. Yours is great.
Yeah. No, I for anybody who maybe that bad joke was lost on, that was definitely not a true statement from me. But yeah, I don't know. I go back and forth between like, do I need to put comments in my docs in my code or not? Mm-hmm. It's tough because there's comments and documentation that like is like an application is very different than a library, right? Because a library, for example, or a tool that's publicly facing or whatever, like there's version management and all kinds of stuff that's a little more baked in, and it's, application code is, I don't know, that's tough. It's a tough one. I don't know. What do you think, Chris? Like, I want to hear from Mocha Man. Mocha Man.
Mocha Man.
Has anybody ever called you Mocha Man? I want to be a Mocha Man.
I like it.
Okay, Suze is literally falling off her chair.
This is the greatest moment in JS Party, in my opinion.
Wait, no. I think the greatest moment is going to be hearing his reaction to being called Mocha Man. Go for it, Mocha Man.
Go for it.
I'm going to have to ignore that. So, what was it was.
I told you. I want to be.
Comments and stuff. Okay, so like I tend to comment. I comment my code a lot.
Me too.
Because I think I'm probably not that good, and so my code is not self-documenting like the geniuses, who write self-documenting code. And so what I write in the comments tends to be, this is my intent for what I'm trying to do here.
Right.
I mean, it's useless if, it's just explaining what the code does.
Not how you're doing or what you're doing, but why. Yeah, exactly.
And as soon as you go and change that code and you don't update the comment, then the comment's out of sync with the code, and it's just horrible. But I think it's really important for, if you're writing code that somebody else is going to come along and try to read and understand, is to make sure that your intent is clear. Because, I don't know if you've heard of Chesterton's fence, right?
No.
I don't even know where it came from, but I know it's like a thing on Wikipedia where it's like, okay, there's a fence out in the middle of the road, and someone comes along and says, hey, why is this fence in the road? Let's tear it down. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And then, I don't know, the moral of the story, skip ahead, is that, you shouldn't remove the fence if you don't know why it's there,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah. It's there for a reason, even though you don't know what it is, right?
Right. And
Yeah.
and so I don't want to write code where it's not clear why it's there, because that's like the worst thing if you're in the business of like maintaining software long term, is to have this code that you're afraid to touch because you don't know what really the intent was in that bit of code. And so I feel like the comments from, on that level. But if we're talking like user-facing APIs, yeah, I try to use doc strings and I try to auto-generate API documentation for my libraries whenever I can. I'll try to provide type declarations, though I don't write TypeScript. I think it's necessary for even the most simple and small libraries. Like if you look at any of Sindre Sorhus's libraries out there, they're all tiny, but they all have documentation, they all have typings, and they're all consistent. So you know that, if I want the sync version of this thing, I'm gonna hit the .sync function, right? And so I think it's really important to have that good documentation in place. Just like, I don't know, it just seems like you got to have it. It's basic.
Actually, so Mocha Man, just kidding. I'm going to stop now. Okay, maybe one more time. Just kidding. No, I won't. Okay. So, Chris.
Yes.
I don't know what's coming next, but I'm scared. So.
Nobody has mentioned yet the importance of tests as a communication of intent and documentation as well. Like, I feel like tests really can document your code as well as like the intent and whatever else. So I think like one of the many benefits of tests is that they serve as a point of documentation. So, write tests, people. And tests are first class.
Yeah.
For production code, first class. I'm sorry.
It's like a thing you don't see a lot in JS. It's because I think the community and the culture hasn't really picked up on it. But if you look at an ecosystem like Rust, like all the API documentation, they're really big on automatic API documentation in Rust, and that's cool. There's, other shortcomings in the documentation, but like having these tests present, and that's like part of the maybe I'm not even thinking of the right thing, but it's essentially like assertions are part of the documentation, and you can look at the code sample, and the code sample is a test, and it makes an assertion about the result of your API call, and you can copy and paste that and just run it. And I think that's great. I think that's something that I would hope to see more of in JavaScript, but we don't do it here. And I mean, JavaScript's more about the kind of free form README instead of these really strict API docs. In Rust, every crate has these API docs, but not in JavaScript, which is too bad.
I will add my amen to that. We did an entire episode on docs. Safia led it. It was really good. We did a deep dive. Obviously, we're not going to do a deep dive right now. That's episode 50 of JS Party, hosted by Safia Abdallah. Chris, you were on that show. I was on that show, so surely we said things that were interesting. I don't remember them. Maybe I should go back and listen as well. But if you want more on documentation, definitely check out episode 50. We're running short on time. Any final thoughts on APIs? What makes them good? What makes them bad? Etc. before we call it a day?
It's okay to provide a low-level API if you are clear about who you're directing that. If you're clear about who your audience is. And so, there are tools out there that are really low level.
That's a good point. And
people probably shouldn't be using directly, but they are anyway, because there's no reasonable abstraction yet around them. I can think of a few in JavaScript. So, I mean, it's okay to do that, but you don't have to make no library you make has to be totally high level all the way to low level. You don't have to do this slow reveal. Depending on the scope of what you're trying to provide users.
Yeah. It's funny, actually, the fetch API, fetch, F-E, I'm not going to spell it. Y'all know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, we get
so
it.
The fetch API was actually designed as a low-level API that was supposed to be for library authors and whatnot, similar to typed arrays and atomics and shared array buffer and blah, 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 blah. All these other low level APIs that like, maybe the average web developer is like, IDK, what do I do with this? They're designed to be used by libraries, that create abstractions that are useful for developers to use. But Fetch was it was a really big surprise when community started adopting Fetch like at scale. And so, that's interesting how that worked out. But I don't see much use of typed array buffer, shared array buffer, or anything else. Like, I don't think too many people are using things like that are low level.
I tried to use it a couple days ago. It was unusable.
Yeah. Like we said earlier, good API design is a hard thing, for sure.
There's also a lot of constraints in software, So we talk about ideals a lot because, of course, we're not going to talk about things that are kind of good, right? Like we're talking about what it could be the best. But we know that as we go out and build things, that the real world hits up against our ideals, and we have to make trade-offs. And so sometimes you have to suffer your API design or the purity or the principles, right? They have to suffer at the behest of the amount of time you have to spend on this, the amount of money you have to spend on this, the team, right? Your own knowledge, because one of the things we know is that we don't know everything. And so I'll know more later is pretty much the way I live my life. And so as you're designing your API, you may think you have designed the best thing you can do until 6 months later when it hits the real world. And you realize that design doesn't actually hold up. So one thing we can tend to do as software developers is get stuck in the paradox of choice, right? And the analysis paralysis, and just not ever get that API done because we want it to be perfect. But you actually do have to move things forward. And so you may not be able to design the perfect API today, and you may never get to that perfect point, but you design what you know and you ship it, and then you find out more once people start using it. So don't forget that as well. Anything else, Suze? Final words before we call it a show?
Yeah, I wanted to actually share an article that was, again, sorry to plug Stripe, but we have this magazine that we put out called
This episode brought to you by... No,
yeah, we should talk about a deal here, yeah.
Yeah, we should.
So Stripe puts out a magazine called Increment Magazine, and our latest issue is actually about APIs, so it's very timely to this episode. All of the articles are really, really, really good. Oh, yep, Jerod's just holding his up.
I'm a subscriber to the Increment Magazine.
I read it on the internet. I should subscribe. I didn't know you could do that.
It's so cool. There's a print edition like that. I just wanted to support that.
They only just started distributing the print edition, so it's a newish thing.
Oh, wow. Well.
But one article I want to call out, because this is almost like a sort of a futures segue to take us out, is there is an article in that specific edition called How Should We Build the APIs Tomorrow? And it's by my colleague Toma. And it just talks about the fact that because we use computers and services at a rapidly kind of evolving pace, we're starting to find that, a lot of things that we've talked about today on what makes a good API and how to write one might actually start limiting us too much in these compromises that we're making, given how many people are coming online and the different sort of even networking challenges we're seeing with that. So I think that it's a great read because it just talks about the fact that we're sort of starting to hit a ceiling, and maybe we should be letting go of some of the status quo around how we do APIs now, and like what we should sort of rebuild, in order to kind of get to the next level of being better at this kind of thing. So I really loved the article. It was a really satisfying read. And even though it doesn't answer a lot of the questions that it poses, that's kind of on us, as a developer community in general, to start kind of trying to think outside the box a little bit. So I just thought it was a really great one to inspire people to think beyond what we currently do with APIs.
Sounds awesome.
I'm inspired just thinking about it.
Yeah, definitely will need to check that out. Well, listeners, all the links to all the things mentioned on the show will be in your show notes. You know where those are. They're there for your easy click. And definitely check out that article. Check out some of the other things mentioned. That's our time for this week. That's our show. Hey, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. We'll talk to you next time. It's December, which means you're probably dusting off the old blog to write your best of 2020 post. It's been a rough year, but we hope JS Party has been a bright spot for you throughout. If so, we would love to be included in your 2020 favorites. Let us know when you publish. We'll share it around our circles. And if you love what we're up to, help us help you by joining Changelog++. It's our membership program, so you can directly support our work and make the ads disappear. Check it out at changelog.com/++. Thanks again to Breakmaster Cylinder for the beats, and our sponsors for having our back, Fastly, Linode, and LaunchDarkly. That's all for this episode. Next week, Adam Wathen from Tailwind CSS joins Nick, Faraz, and myself for an information-dense episode that we managed to make ridiculous in typical JS Party fashion. Stay tuned for that one hitting your feed next week.
In 5+ years of writing JS full-time, I've basically never needed to know it.